Hello, welcome and a very good evening. Today I want to open up my Commodore PET. The Commodore PET is a very old computer. This one is as old as I am. It's from 1979 and it's a nice machine made from metal, and it's a very old machine. It's the predecessor of the VIC20 and the C64 and shares a lot of similar technology as those more popular models. It was pretty expensive back in the day, but can do not as much as the C64. It has only text mode graphics, no color graphics, and only this one here has only a measly 16 kilobytes of RAM, which was quite a lot back in the day. But for us, it's not enough, because this year there came a new game called Attack of the Petscii Robots by the 8-bit guy, also known as David Murray. And this game runs on the C64, on the VIC20, and also on the Commodore PET. And we want to play this game, but it requires 32 kilobytes of RAM, which this machine doesn't have right now. But in one of our last live streams we soldered this nice little expansion, which has 32 kilobytes of static RAM, a ROM expansion, and a socket for the CPU. So we need to open up the PET, remove the CPU, put the CPU in here, and put this thing into the PET. However, I fear we might need to do a little bit of cleaning first, because this machine hasn't been in use for decades, and I can already see from the outside that it will be very dusty inside. So we start off by opening up the chassis, taking out the main board and dusting it off with some compressed air and some alcohol and some anti-static brushes until we can actually see what chip is which, and we can safely remove the CPU and place that thing in there. So let's open up this thing and get out the motherboard. Okay, so this is the main board, and it has quite a lot of ICs. Down here we have 16 1 kilobyte DRAM chips for a total of 16 kilobytes. This one doesn't have any more sockets. There are versions of the board, I think, that have enough for 32 kilobytes. But I guess this board was probably used for the 8 kilobyte and 16 kilobyte versions. The 8 kilobyte would have one bank only populated, but this one has both populated. I think up here somewhere should be the CPU. I see a 6520. Yeah, that's the CPU over here. Interesting enough, the next chip also says 6520, 6522 and 6502. Okay, which probably means that the 6502 is probably the CPU. I will look this up. This over here should be the ROM chips. And there's also empty sockets for option ROMs. I will use some compressed air in a minute to clean off most of this, and also pour some isopropyl alcohol and use the anti-static brush to wipe away most of the dirt. The edge connectors also look pretty nasty, so I will wipe them down more thoroughly. These should be the voltage regulators. Since the machine is running, I'm not going to touch these, but it's probably a good idea to check those. The same goes for the big capacitors, but they don't look like they are bulging or anything. The smaller ones look okay too. But if you have any problems with such a machine, then it's always a good place to check for all the voltage regulators, for all the voltage rails with the multimeter, and also check the capacitors for any obvious leaks. Obviously, also the ICs are very old, so any of those can fail at any time. It's always a problem or risk. But I think we don't need to touch any of this today. This will be just a cleaning job. Furthermore, the keyboard of this machine is not in the greatest shape. Some keys are not working properly, probably due to this dust. I'm not gonna touch this today. That should be a different video, or at least a different project for me, because that will take quite some time to take apart and clean. So yeah, I will see you in a minute after I dusted off this, and we will wipe this down with alcohol and then remove the CPU and plug in the expansion. So this is all the dirt that came off. The board is still a little bit nasty. However, I think it's good enough to be worked on. We also destroyed and devastated a lot of Q-tips. But that's okay. The newest chip that I found while looking over this board is from VIC20 79, so probably sometime in March, which puts an estimate on when this machine was built. So probably before summer 79, which is pretty old. We will remove the CPU now, which is the 6502. These here are the PIAs, interface adapters, and the versatile interface adapter here. But we need to remove only this one. Take care of the notch, because that's our orientation guideline. And we will insert the expansion and make it so that the RAM is enabled, but we will disable all the ROMs and enable them at a later point to see if the RAM works already. Contrary to what I said earlier, I actually decided to refurbish the keyboard because it was so dirty, and I think it's a good idea because several keys were stuck. So I started removing the keyboard by removing the 12 screws that hold it in place. Afterwards, I could disassemble the keyboard by unscrewing more of the smaller screws on the back of the PCB. Then we could take off the PCB, clean it with IPA, and clean all the keys in soapy water. Let's have a look what it looks like and how it was done. And also check out the end result, because I think it was definitely worthwhile. So there you have it. This is the keyboard, and as you can see, it is dirty as anything in this machine. So it was definitely a good choice to remove it. And now we'll start cleaning it with soapy water for the keys and IPA for the plungers. This is a tedious task, and it took me about 2 hours or so to get it all done and let the keys dry overnight. But in the end, I had a perfectly working keyboard again, so that was definitely a very good choice. So now it's time to put everything back together. The mainboard goes in, the keyboard goes in, and we have the upgrade module installed, and we will turn on the machine and see if it still works. And actually, let's flip the switch, and all fingers crossed, well, it does turn on, but as you can see now, it doesn't really work. There is garbage on the screen, which means that probably the ROM was flashed incorrectly, so let's go back to flashing. Okay, so the first try was not a big success. We saw that the expansion seems to work kind of. I narrowed it down that the ROM was actually bad. I think the ROM that I chose was probably incompatible somehow. Everything else seemed to work. So I'm gonna use one of these old flash ROMs, an AT29C010. I don't think you can buy them anymore. This one here is from 1996. But they should work just fine. We have the KiB 3 programmer here, which I showed how I refurbished it in another video. So we plug that in here. Note that the notch is facing in the right direction. It's connected to the 486 via parallel cable. And then we can actually start the KiB 3 software. And it already knows that it's an AT29C010. And it says insert device, and after going to the programming, it's doing its thing. And hopefully this will simply work. So let's wait for this to finish. Okay, so device programmed. It compared successfully, so this chip should be fine in theory. So we will unplug it, take it out, and carefully, very carefully insert it into the socket here. And after that we can open up our... Oh, look at this. There's one leg that is trying to escape. Always make sure that all the legs are aligned. We can look at it like this. And gently, very gently press down. This looks excellent. I think this should work. So let's open up the PET, install the expansion, and if it works, we have a full success. So now it's the second try with the new ROM. Let's switch it on. And we get Commodore Basic version 4. So the ROM upgrade worked and we have 32 kilobytes of RAM, which means also the RAM upgrade worked. Before we try out the game, we should have a little look inside the box. The box is very nicely made. It is very similar to the Planet X3 box, which I happen to have here. It's the same size, so I guess he used the same provider for the box and the media and stuff. And I think the box and the manual was designed by Anders Enger Jensen. The title picture I think was done by someone else. But let's open it, or first let's have a look. On the back you see a couple of screenshots for the PET, VIC20 and the C64 versions, which are all a bit different. I think the PET version looks nice. The C64 version with PET graphics or with the bitmap graphics or extended graphics, and the VIC20 version. All very nicely, and everything is actually in here. Plus one weird adapter that we will talk about in a minute. The floppy disk with this side C64 version and the back side is VIC20 and PET versions, because probably most people will play the C64 version, since the C64 is the most ubiquitous of the machines. Last but not least, there's the manual, which is nicely designed, and here's Planet X3, and here's the keyboard layout on the PET, how you move, where the movement keys are, search, use, etc. But you can redefine that. Here's the Commodore C64 keyboard layout and the VIC20 layout. And also, if you want to use a Super Nintendo controller, which I totally recommend, especially on the PET with its very old and crappy keyboard. And there's all the stuff about the game. I won't go into detail here because there are quite a few reviews. I just want to say this much. I like this game much better than Planet X3. Planet X3 is an absolute great tech demo. It runs on very slow hardware with very nice graphics and music. However, I think it's not that great of a game actually. But this one here, I think, is much better, and it's actually pretty hard, I think, but also with a lot of nice concepts and interesting ideas. From the movement keys and all the tile-based rendering. It's sort of similar to Planet X3, but this style of gaming where you have to disable robots, solve puzzles, lends itself much better to the game flow that you have with this engine compared to a real-time strategy game where you, in Planet X3, had to micromanage all your units, and I didn't particularly like that aspect. But here you only have your one guy and you have to kill all the robots and crush them in interesting and funny ways. So let's have a look at the adapter. This is for attaching a SNES controller. Works on all the Commodore PET and VIC20, and it goes into the user port. There's also an audio jack here for the PET specifically, because the PET doesn't have an audio chip. So you can use the user port to put out some beeps, and we'll hear that later. And this is just your regular SNES cheapo controller, and it slots right into this here. And then you put this on the backside of your PET, and you have sound and a relatively nice controller. Movement is here, shooting is on the colored buttons, the shoulder buttons do searching and stuff, and you can swap weapons or activate items using select and start. So very nice that this is included in the box, because it makes playing on the PET so much better. Well, other than that, I don't have a floppy drive on the PET, so I'll take a disk image of this and put it on my SD2PET floppy emulator, and we can then fire up the game. Okay, for loading the game, we actually have to load. We don't have to load it first, but we will load the so-called wedge from the SD card, which gives us a few more basic commands which make loading easier. For example, add cd::VIC Robots will switch to the disk image for the VIC Robots game, or that's basically the side B of the game, and we can type add $ to get the disk listing. Using /pet robots will then load the actual game, and this is much shorter and much easier to do than typing out the 1541 commands by themselves. Hitting run gives us very quickly the actual game, and you can hear already there's some kind of music in the background, which is quite simplistic, but it's nevertheless a very nice feature to have some music there. We can go down to the controls and set up the game to use the Super NES controller actually, which makes life that much easier on the pad, because the pad, let's face it, still has a pretty rubbish keyboard. I think the C64 keyboard is much nicer. Now it's loading the first map, and we will show just a little bit of the game here. I won't do a proper review, but it suffices to say that it plays very nicely. It scrolls pretty quickly. There's of course no smooth scrolling with the text mode, but well, it looks actually pretty sharp and detailed. And the game plays really well. I mean, it's really not that far off from the C64 version. Of course, the graphics are better on the C64, but the gameplay is exactly the same. And that's very nice, and this game would have been huge if it had come out back in 1980 or something, although most people wouldn't have had probably a PET with 32 kilobytes of RAM, but that's a different problem. So I'll leave it at that here. I'll show you a few more clips from the game, but I won't spoil anything. Plus, I'm pretty lousy at destroying the robots. But I must say, I like the game, and it's definitely by far the best game that you can get on the PET. And it's also one of the coolest game releases of 2020 or 2021 for the C64 and the VIC20. What do I think of Petscii Robots and of the PET itself and the upgrade? I think the Commodore PET was a seminal computer because it was one of the earliest personal computers that was mass-produced and not a kit. This particular machine is from 1979, so that was 2 years into the life of the PET, which I think came out in 1977 along with the Apple II and the TRS-80. So those were the machines that you could buy back then as a business owner or maybe even as a home user with a lot of disposable money. And yeah, this one is a European version and it runs quite nicely. It has its age-related problems like the keyboard, but overall it's in great shape, and adding the RAM expansion allowed me to play Attack of the Petscii Robots, and I must say it's actually a pretty nice game. I haven't beat it yet, I'm still struggling with all the maps, but I actually quite like it, and I think given a bit of time you can actually manage to beat it and find a lot of interesting ways to solve the puzzles in there. So I surely recommend it. I probably will try playing it on the C64 as well, because I wanna not stress this machine too much. At some point the CRT will get some problems, I guess, and yeah, this is a nice machine, but not for playing 10 hours at a time or something, which I wouldn't recommend anyway. But yeah, I like to do this project and it worked out pretty well. So for today I think that's it. Make sure to check out Attack of the Petscii Robots, and other than that, share, like, and definitely subscribe. Leave a comment, tell me if you ever used a PET, if it was known to you before, because I never have seen one before, except once. So this is a pretty rare machine to me. And yeah, I hope to hear some comments and see you in the next video. Bye.